Welcome all to the Super Memory for Schools program. My name is Yep. Currently, I am a teacher at Windu Junior High School located in Gobat District. And the first lesson that we are learning is World History with Lesson 1, which is the Soviet Union from 1945 to the early 90s of the 20th century. There are three main parts of this lesson. Firstly, we will learn about the economic recovery of the Soviet Union after World War II. In the second part, we will learn about the construction of socialism in the Soviet Union from the 50s to the early 70s of the 20th century. And the third part, we will learn about how the Soviet Union fell into crisis and collapsed. Firstly, let's go through part 1, my dears. After World War II, although it was a victorious country, the Soviet Union suffered heavy losses. More than 27 million people died. Thousands of factories, businesses, tunnels, roads, bridges, and culverts were destroyed. And the war devastated the Soviet Union, leaving the country in ruins. And the war slowed down the Soviet economy by 10 years. Faced with this situation, the leadership of the party and state of the Soviet Union decided to propose a fourth five-year plan. The objectives were to restore the economy and heal wounds of wars. And you know what? With fighting spirit and determination towards victory beforehand, with all the efforts of all people, this fourth five-year plan was successful, completed 9 months ahead of schedule. And all plans exceeded the set target. Specifically, industrial production increased by 73%, while industrial production was expected to increase by only 48%. Agricultural production was overestimated before the war. People's lives were improved. Not only that, but the Soviet Union also achieved brilliant achievements in science and technology. It was in 1949 the Soviet Union successfully built an atomic bomb, which broke the US nuclear monopoly. After completing the economic recovery, the Soviet Union embarked on the construction of socialism from the early 50s to the early 70s of the 20th century. To carry out construction of socialism, the Soviet Union continued to implement the next five-year plans. In the fifth, sixth, and seventh plans, the direction was to prioritize the development of the heavy industry, which was the foundation of the national economic intensive farming and agricultural production, paying attention to scientific and technical development, and protecting the national defense. And only in the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union achieved great achievements in the economy. For example, industrial production increased by an average of 9.6% per year. The Soviet Union became a powerful industrialized country, ranked second in the world after the United States, and industrial output accounted for 20% of the world's industrial output. But not only that, the Soviet Union also achieved brilliant achievement in science and technology. It was in 1957 the Soviet Union successfully launched the artificial satellite to space to start the era of human conquest of the universe. In 1961, the Soviet Union launched the Orient spacecraft to bring the cosmonaut Gagarin around the Earth. You all please observe the following pictures to see the achievements of the Soviet Union in nation's construction. This is the first satellite put into space by the Soviet Union. And this is the Oriental spacecraft that brought the cosmonaut Gagarin around the Earth. This is a picture of the cosmonaut Gagarin. So, do you know who was Vietnam's first cosmonaut? That is Pham Nhat. The Soviet Union not only achieved brilliant achievements in the economy, science, and technology, but also in foreign policy. The Soviet Union advocated maintaining world peace, friendly relations with all countries, and always actively supported the struggle against colonialism. And the Soviet Union deserved to be the pillar of the world peace. Thus, with the achievements of Soviet Union, the Soviet Union turned the US global strategy upside down and strengthened the socialist faction and the mainstay for world peace. However, after a period of strong development in the early 70s of the 20th century, the Soviet Union also began to fall into crisis. And now we will find out the crisis and collapse of socialism in the Soviet Union. In what context did the crisis and collapse of the Soviet Union take place? And what were the causes that led the crisis and collapse of Soviet socialism? Let's find out together. And do you know what? In 1973, the world broke out in an oil crisis. And it was a starting point for the crisis of many aspects of the world. It required countries at that time to have socio-economic reforms to bring the country out of the crisis. In this context, the leaders of the Soviet Union failed to carry out necessary socio-economic reforms, as well as not promptly repair mistakes and shortcomings in the previous economic development, and that made the country fall more and more into crisis in many aspects such as stagnant production, people's lives were more difficult, inflation, expensive prices, shortage of goods. In addition, legal violations were undemocratic and unfair in the society. Bureaucracy and corruption were getting worse and pushed the Soviet Union to a state of full-blown crisis. And in that context, in March 1985, President Gorbachev took over the leadership of the Soviet Union and state, and to set out a reform path to overcome difficulties and solve the crisis. This is a portrait of President Gorbachev. Then, what was the content of Gorbachev reform at that time? Many economic development plans were proposed, but nothing was done, even making the economy weaker and weaker. On the other hand, he promoted political reforms such as implementing the president's centralized all-power system, implement political pluralism, i.e., multi-party system, remove the leadership role of a communist party, and at the same time declare democracy openly in all respects. And what were the results of the reform? It was that the country was sinking deeper and deeper into crisis and disorder. The rallies took place repeatedly, and the republics demanded succession, and the struggle movements of the masses took place everywhere. And the reactionaries took advantage of this situation to incite the masses against the government. Faced with that situation, a number of leaders in the party and state of the Soviet Union made a coup to demand to overthrow President Gorbachev. But the coup failed and led to an incalculable consequence. That was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was suspended. The federal state was paralytic and faced with that situation. On December 21, 1991, 11 leaders in the Soviet Union signed an agreement to dissolve the Soviet Union to establish a community of independent states, which was shortly called the NSG bloc. You all please look at this map of the NSG countries. The yellow areas are the countries in the community of the independent nations. You all please continue to find out. It was a cold night on December 25, 1991 that President Gorbachev announced his resignation, and the flag on the roof of the Kremlin was lowered, marking the collapse of the Soviet Union's socialism after 74 years of existence. So, what are the causes of the collapse of the Soviet Union? First, it built a socialist model that had been not scientific, not humane, and had many defects. Second, it was subjective will-only leadership. Third, it was due to the resistance of reactionary hostile forces inside the country and abroad. Fourth, it was not keeping up with the advances of scientific revolution, which made the economy more and more stagnant, and in addition, it was subjective not to carry out necessary reforms when the world situation had many changes. Thus, this brings us to the end of the lesson. In this lesson, you all please notice the following main points. First, pay attention to the economic recovery in the Soviet Union after World War II. Second, how the Soviet Union built socialism and what great achievements have been achieved. And the third point we will pay attention to is how did the Soviet Union fall into crisis and collapse in a historical context? And what caused that collapse? I wish you all happy and comfortable while studying. See you in the next Super Memory for School program. Goodbye.